virtual talk today. My name's Jennifer Northam. I'm an alum from the class of 1991, and I've been a member of the alumni office staff for more than 12 years. It's finally fall on campus, and students have just returned from October break, and now comes the mad dash to Thanksgiving. Our varsity athletic teams have been having excellent seasons, and you can check them out on the athletics website, which is whitmanblues.com. And alumni, keep an eye out for Witty News. Our monthly newsletter will be in your email box on Friday afternoon. Now that that's out of the way, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Alissa Cordner. Alissa is Associate Professor of Sociology at Whitman and a Garrett Fellow. She earned her PhD in sociology from Brown University in 2013 and joined the Whitman faculty shortly thereafter. At Whitman, Alissa teaches courses in sociology and environmental studies, including social problems, environmental sociology, environmental health, and environmental justice. Alissa's research focuses on environmental sociology, the sociology of risk and disasters, environmental health and justice, and politics and participation. Her two major areas of research are the social and political aspects of wildlife risk management and the social and scientific discoveries of perfluorinated chemicals. Professor Cordner is the co-director of the PFAS Project Lab, studying the forever chemicals you may have been hearing about in the news, together with researchers at Northeastern University. This project engages Whitman students every year as research assistants. She has published a multitude of peer-reviewed articles, as well as an award-winning book called Toxic Safety, Flame Retardants, Chemical Controversies, and Environmental Health. Alissa is freshly back from sabbatical, where she was embedded with wildland firefighters to better experience and understand the risks of their job. And now she will share that research with you. Alissa, I turn the program over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Nice to be here, and thanks to folks for joining us. I'm really happy to be able to share some of my research on wildland firefighters, and in particular, some of the environmental health hazards that they experience in the course of their work, especially those hazards that don't get a whole lot of attention. I think this project fits really nicely within a public health framework, and public health is something that Whitman has been preparing our students for a long time, and we're just now in the process of formally establishing a public health program. So I'll talk more about that at the end. But this research is really, it grows out of my work for over 10 years now, looking at wildland fire risk management and trying to understand how risks to firefighters, risks to the public, risks to natural resources are changing with the confluence of factors that are increasing the severity and intensity of individual fires and the longevity of fire season. So we have a buildup of fuels thanks to over a century of very vigorous and effective suppression. We have the climate crisis, increasing droughts, increasing heat, and wind events that can increase fire intensity. And then we have the growth of development in the wildland-urban interface. This picture comes from a neighborhood in Wenatchee, and maybe it's a little hard to tell, but imagine all those burned homes in the foreground are right on the edge of a beautiful bluff looking out over a nice natural area, and a fire just tore right up that hillside. So we have an increasing population living really in really close proximity to spaces that have a lot of these fuels. And sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides are not advancing. Sorry, folks, give me 1 second. Let me try taking this off and then starting it back up again, because I want to be able to talk to you and also see my notes so that I can read you some of the field note snippets that I have to share. So let's try this now. Well, it's not working. I'm just going to have to, I think, do this more manually than I would like to otherwise. what if I do? I'll do my best. We'll see how this goes. So we're all familiar as well with impacts of smoke to the general public. I think anyone at this point, probably anywhere, almost anywhere in the country, but certainly anywhere in the Northwest, wildland fire smoke is a familiar experience throughout the fire season. We see increasing amounts of unhealthy smoke exposure to the general public. And we're all familiar with trying to, experiencing smoke and then trying to pin it to particular fires as well. Firefighters are really are a population that experiences obviously more exposure to smoke. And as a result, they have increasing rates of certain health effects. So wildland firefighters experience routine occupational exposures to particulate matter, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, volatile organic compounds or VOCs, crystalline silica, black carbon, asbestos, radionuclides, and heavy metals, all of which are known carcinogens. And firefighters' exposure to smoke can increase their risk of mortality from lung cancer, heart disease, and other forms of cardiovascular disease. And this is a major concern, a growing concern for fire and land management agencies. There's been a lot of public attention to wildland firefighter health in the recent months as well. And so this then brings me, the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, has recently identified working as a firefighter, including both structural and wildland firefighters, as carcinogenic to humans. And this is their strongest, this is IARC's strongest category of carcinogens. And so this brings me to the overall questions that guide my research. What motivates changes to wildland fire risk management, with particular attention for this project to the risks that firefighters experience in the course of their work. My methods are qualitative methods. I've been doing participant observation with federal wildland firefighters since 2015. And I am a red-carded firefighter type 2. I volunteer with my local county fire department to maintain those qualifications, and also just to gain additional experience and stay involved in the field as a practitioner. That work doesn't directly inform my research, but it certainly informs my overall understanding of firefighter health and safety. My research is focused on an interagency fire management organization in Oregon that very generously has allowed me to shadow and fill in on crews with them throughout multiple different fire seasons. So I did 3 summers or full fire seasons starting in 2015. Most recently, I also went back in the summer of 2024 for some short-term research, and I spent about 2 weeks embedded with fire crews there, going out with crews, filling in on hand crews and engines, and trying to also report back on some of the things that I had found and gain a better understanding of what the firefighters I'd worked with thought about the things that I was coming across. I came to the topic of environmental health hazards that I'll focus on today originally by trying to understand how firefighter safety policies have changed and developed over recent years. So firefighters are, their work is influenced by many different formal and informal safety policies, including the 10 and 18, the 10 standard firefighting orders and the 18 watch out situations that is on the cover of every firefighter's IRPG, drilled into you during physical training. It really sort of sets the standard for what firefighters should be paying attention to. There are other, there are really clear connections between firefighter safety policies and tragedy incidents, in particular incidents where multiple firefighters have died from an entrapment situation. And so I looked in a paper that was recently published in the International Journal of Wildland Fire. I looked at different factors that motivated changes in firefighter safety policies and looked at these tragedy incidents, combined with really intentional work by land management agencies to implement a learning or a safety culture within their organizations, and identified how these tragedy incidents, along with external factors, have really led to dramatic changes in firefighter safety on the ground. And what I argued was that in addition to the formal work that agencies have done, and to the triggering impact of particular incidents, that, you know, for me as a sociologist, it's really important to also consider external factors that might matter as well. And so I identified 4 different categories of external factors that have also influenced the development of firefighter safety policies and practices. I'm very happy to talk more about this, or just to send people the paper if you have questions about this. Just to give one example, there have been a lot of changes in the material culture and technologies that firefighters use, changes that have led to really direct changes in their safety on the fire line. So when I began my in-depth research in 2015, all the engines that I wrote along with had physical paper maps, or sort of laminated paper maps that were folded and put under the seats. And if, when an incident was called in, you'd pull out the paper map and you'd find the township, range, and section, and you would navigate based on those paper maps through these very labyrinthian country roads, and you would get to the fire that way. When I returned this most recent summer for my field work, I never saw a paper map used during the 2 weeks that I was in the field with folks, even though I was out in the field every single day during my research time. And instead, everyone's using Avenza or other online maps. And so an incident comes in and people plot the coordinates on their map, or it's linked up with an automated dispatch system. And people are navigating that way. And there are tremendous benefits to that in terms of timeliness and ability to zoom out or zoom in and cross maps. And there are also potential drawbacks in terms of folks maybe not learning the roads in as much of an embodied way or an intuitive way as they might otherwise. And then, of course, questions about what would happen when the phone battery dies, or when you're out of any sort of range. Another example is the use of drones. Drones have really taken over many different uses in wildland fire, many of them actually replacing some of the higher exposure work that firefighters were doing. So in prescribed fire operations now, sometimes instead of sending people into really treacherous areas, they'll use drones and they'll do some aerial ignition that way. So all this is those are all examples of how changes that are completely external to fire, so better GPS technologies, everyone having a tiny computer in your pocket in the form of your phone, or the advances in drone technology, these external factors have really dramatically changed how firefighters are experiencing safety on the line. So now I'll turn and talk more about the focus of my presentation today, which is on environmental health hazards that firefighters are experiencing. I'm actually teaching my environmental health class this semester. It's an upper level class that's cross-listed between sociology and environmental studies, and looks at environmental health in a really interdisciplinary way. The students have their midterms tomorrow, wish them luck. So when we think about environmental health, we're thinking about multiple ways people can be exposed to things that could be harmful to them. And in particular, we think about inhalation exposure, so breathing in, ingestion exposure, things that you're consuming and then end up in your digestive system, and then dermal exposure or contact exposure. And these are the ones that matter the most for wildland firefighters. There is a lot of attention to certain known hazards that firefighters are experiencing on the line, in particular wildland fire smoke, so vegetation smoke. There's also a lot of attention to heat. to the role of heat in either direct harm to the body, or heat as leading to certain types of fatigue or heat-related injuries. There is quite a bit of attention to the associated risks of risks on the cardiac system, and that includes risks, cardiac risks through physical training and exercise, as well as the PAC test, which is the annual fitness test that wildland folks do. There's attention to fatigue and diet, and the importance of nutrition for firefighters. And there is growing attention to trauma and mental health needs among wildland firefighters, although this is a real gap, and the few studies that are out there that are trying to systematically understand wildland firefighters' mental health needs have some, they both raise a lot of concerns, and they have some pretty, they're relatively narrow, or they ask a narrow range of questions, or they have a small sample size. So lots of data needs there. And these are risks that firefighters themselves are really aware of from my experiences. But I identified other hazards where there's really limited attention to these hazards. And I categorized them into three clunky groups: routine but unacknowledged hazards, hazards that are specific to incidents based on type of response, and then location-specific hazards. So first, I'll talk about several different types of non-vegetation smoke hazards. And so according to the Red Book, which is the policy manual that drives wildland firefighting, wildland firefighters are not supposed to engage in non-vegetation response. They're supposed to, if they respond to a car fire, for example, they're not supposed to engage in that fire unless there's immediate threat to their lives, or potentially if there is a real concern of it moving on to the land that they're supposed to protect. But in the course of my research, I found that wildland folks respond to non-vegetation incidents or are exposed to non-vegetation smoke in a lot of ways. So here's an example of where the engine I was with responded to a car fire that was in the middle of the forest that they were protecting. You can see here the engine captain and one of the other firefighters. They put the fire out first by spraying the car from a distance, but then actually manually using their gloved hands to open up the hood of the car to get the nozzle under there. And this is from my field notes. We kept our heads away from the smoke as much as possible, but I still got a bit of the nasty chemical rubber tasting smoke. It was like it coated my tongue with burnt rubber. And so this is just an example of how you can have really close exposure to non-vegetation smoke, even if technically the job of the wildland firefighter isn't to respond to this type of incident. There's also a growing presence of what folks call non-resident campers on public lands, including state and federally managed lands. And these are folks who are camping on the forest, but not for recreation, but rather because this is where they are living. And there are, and what that means is that then this part of the forest, or this part of grassland becomes an urban area, becomes an area filled with all of the stuff that comes along with human settlement. So this is an incident we responded to. You can see here's a campfire that's being put out. And then here's another example from my field notes. This field note excerpt doesn't respond to this particular incident, but this is what I had a picture of. So in this instance, a crew captain described responding to a fire in an encampment that was literally a pile of trash burning in a hole in the ground. To reduce their exposures, they fiber taped a hose to a tree so it sprayed water into the hole, allowing them to empty their engine into the fire but be farther away from the smoke. Because if this type of encampment burns up, you have all the fuel that is not just the trees and the needles, but you have the coolers, and you have the RV, and you have vehicles, and you might have a propane tank, and all of the human possessions that we all that humans have. As another even more extreme example, this was a guard station on a national forest that burned up completely in an incident. A firefighter working on this incident described being part of that response. It burned down engines, buildings, Roundup, spray paint, propane tanks, bar oil, and all their personal possessions. This person described the smoke as thick and recalled coughing up black stuff for a couple of days. He had to get an inhaler to open up his lungs. And while this experience is certainly extreme, it really accurately represents the intensity of potential hazards that are wildland urban interface hazards, but that wildland firefighters might be responding to even if the incident is in the forest. Another example that is quite routine, but not seen as a hazard in the same way that a burned up guard station might be. Another example is associated with pile burning. So one of the ways that slash can be piled and then burned in a later season is that you make the pile, and then after the pile gets to be a certain size, you lay plastic, or you can lay a thick paper over that. But the district that I was on typically used plastic. And then you pile some more onto it. And then you come back the next season or a year later, a year and a half later, and you burn it. The fuel has dried out. The idea is that the plastic keeps the wood underneath nice and dry so that the fire will carry really well once you light those piles. You might then think that when you're lighting piles, you aren't exposed to high levels of smoke, but that's not what I or other firefighters experience when they're actually burning piles. Here's an excerpt from a day that I spent burning piles with fuels technicians. The burning piles gave up a ton of smoke. I could hold my breath in the smoke long enough to either wait for clean air to be blown in or to step outside of the smoke. But a few times the smoke was so consuming, it burned my eyes and took away sight completely, showing that there's clearly exposure to whatever is being burned up in those piles. So just another example of how even in addition to the extensive attention to wood smoke, there are other things that firefighters are being exposed to routinely. And plastic, when it burns, releases dioxins and furans, which are known carcinogens. Another hazard that came up very frequently, and so now we're moving even farther away from those hazards that are widely recognized, away from the smoke and into the world of dust. Dust was widely recognized as a ubiquitous exposure, but not always as a hazard. I never heard dust covered in an official training course or a morning briefing as a hazard, even though firefighters themselves expressed concern about their exposure to dust. And if you've ever driven on a dusty country road or walked on a dusty trail, you know what it's like to have the sort of fine moon dust kicked up constantly around you. It was fun as I was pulling this paper together to get to actually include discussions of snot and boogers in an academic paper. That was a first for me. But one of I really became tuned into dust for a couple of reasons. One, dust, depending on where you are, dust can have pretty high levels of silica, and silica is a known respiratory carcinogen. And then second, I spent some time with a technically retired career firefighter who retired and then became a contractor working on large incidents. And when we were talking, and he basically said, the thing I worry about is dust. He spends a lot of time in camp, in extended incident camps, and you might be around dust. You might be breathing in dust 12 or 16 hours a day. Anytime you're not sleeping, you might be breathing in dust. And you don't always know what might be in that dust or whether the levels of exposure are concerning. Another category of routine but largely unacknowledged hazards are the chemicals that are in personal protective equipment. Wildland firefighters typically wear their Nomex pants most of the day. So you have your greens, the pants, and then you have your yellows, the shirt, which the shirt might only be worn, the yellow might only be worn during an active incident, but it was very typical at least on the district that I worked on, to wear your greens all day long, except when you were maybe doing physical training, or maybe during morning briefing. Even then, sometimes many folks wore their greens all day. This is a concern because anything that you're dermally exposed to through your gear can end up as a route of dermal exposure, or can be a source of incidental ingestion exposure. And this is clearly a concern for firefighters who eat their meals in the field. For example, when I would go out with crews, meals in the field were often eaten either sitting in the truck and you put your food on your lap, or sitting on the ground out in the woods. And so then you would have either food to textile contact, or you would have hand exposure, and that would lead to, again, incidental ingestion. And so firefighters are expected to be chronically exposed to any chemicals that are in their personal protective equipment. And what might be in their PPE? Well, the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, found high levels of PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances, in wildland firefighting textiles. PFAS are highly toxic at remarkably low doses. They are regulated in drinking water at the parts per trillion level, and the levels that were found in some wildland textiles were higher than the levels found in structural firefighting gloves and hoods. So levels that really are a concern in terms of amount of exposure. A nuclear physicist, Graham Peasley, tested some samples of wildland firefighting gear and found some levels of PFAS, relatively low levels in his interpretation, but high levels of bromine, levels that he thought were indicative of intentional treatment of the textile with brominated flame retardants, which are known hormone disruptors and carcinogens, and also measurable levels of zinc or zinc oxides, which he suspected were used as antimicrobial, antifungal agents, flame retardants, or as a UV protection layer for fabrics. These are not exposures that are widely discussed by firefighters themselves or recognized by fire management agencies. But again, because firefighters might be wearing their greens 16 plus hours a day if they're on extended incident, there's a lot of potential for chronic exposure. In addition, firefighters can be exposed to other types of their gear. So here again is that photo of the car fire, not to emphasize the car, but to emphasize the foam. This is a Class A foam, a foam used, not the type of foam that have lots of PFAS, but foams that can be used on wildland engines. Class A foams carry warning labels for skin and eye irritation, allergic reactions, skin corrosion, respiratory irritation, central nervous system damage, and reproductive effects. The Class A foam that we used on the district I worked at was labeled with danger, causes serious skin irritation, causes serious eye irritation. And the warning label then said, if you're exposed, you should immediately flush with clean water. And that type of intervention may be completely impossible if you're on a wildland incident. Another hazard is the smoke that might come from ignition devices. Here's a picture of a fusee. Fusees are handheld ignition devices that are used in prescribed burning, in backfires, and in burnouts. And the firing devices unit of the wildland firefighter training courses lists fusees' noxious fumes as a quote-unquote disadvantage for this device. Historically, fusees contained perchlorate, which is a chemical used in, I believe it's rocket fuel, that is hazardous to human reproduction and is a hormone disruptor. Current use fusees don't contain perchlorate, but still the fusee brand that's used exclusively by US federal agencies, it's perchlorate free, but it still contains other toxicants that lead the manufacturer to designate fusees as hazardous for skin, eye, and respiratory irritation. And when I was trained on how to use a fusee, our instructor told us to always hold our breath when you're lighting a fusee, because you don't want to especially catch that initial inhalation. Sort of like, imagine a match, when you strike a match and there's that initial flare up and that smell, but then multiply that by a couple orders of magnitude. One of my classmates in that course, as I have here in my field notes, she got a lungful of that smoke lighting her fusee, and she said she could still taste it at dinner that night. And so that type of smoke exposure is certainly a concern for firefighters. And fusees might be used really routinely in the course of their work. Firefighters can also be exposed to all kinds of other exhaust types, fuels, and oil liquids. So here's an example of firefighters running a small water pump that's a small two-stroke engine. And these types of pumps run off a mixed fuel, and depending on how well maintained they are, how sort of what their sort of good working order is, the exhaust can be quite thick, and a firefighter might be assigned to operate a pump or run the engine or run a saw for, not just an hour at a time, but perhaps for a full 16-hour shift. Firefighters also do special projects when they are on base. And so here, for example, a firefighter is cutting a large log to help make a bench that ultimately will be stained. And so all these things can lead to routine exposure to different oils and fuels, which have different exposure concerns. And so I just listed here some of the things that firefighters could either very, very routinely be exposed to, or could be reasonably expected to be exposed to over the course of a season. Small engine exhaust, vehicle exhaust, wood dust, diesel fuel, gasoline, mixed fuel, engine oil, transmission oil, chainsaw bar oil, and then for special projects, things like pesticides, stains, and paints. And many of these have been well studied in individual contexts or individual occupations, and have been shown to be of significant concern for human health. And then you think about how firefighters might be, a sawyer might be running a saw for, say 10 hours out of their 16-hour shift, every day for 14 days, and they're constantly breathing in those fumes. So they might have very high and long-term exposure. So now I'll switch over to some, so I've moved from those hazards that are routine, part of the sort of daily life, or very commonplace, regardless of where you are. Now there's a cluster of hazards that are specific to where an incident might be. So the first is exposure to radiation and mining hazards. This is a picture I took while shadowing a complex incident management team near a former nuclear weapons site. And so this site has significant levels of radioactive contamination. During a briefing, one of the folks joked, well, the good news is if the fire crosses into Hanford, you won't need a light stick, because the joke was that Hanford is that radioactive. Hanford is not that radioactive. It does not actually glow in the dark. But there are certainly concerns about radioactivity on certain sites. There are concerns about munitions or unexploded ordnances. For example, there was a prescribed fire, I think 2 years ago, where some of the firefighters, when they were doing ignitions, they found unexploded ordnance from a military operation. There also have been concerns about mines, either abandoned mines or in-use mines, and then concerns about fires that might be on or near Superfund sites. Hanford has that lovely distinction of being both a former nuclear weapons facility and a Superfund site. There was another fire last year, I believe, that burned into the area of an asbestos mine. So there's just lots of location-specific concerns that might be relevant for firefighters' exposure. The next category of incident-specific exposures is about food and nutrition. Sometimes the food on incidents is really great. There's a lot of variety, a lot of high quality, calorically dense food. Firefighters on average are imagined to get between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day. It's an incredibly physical job, and there's a tremendous amount of need for high quality nutrition. But I heard all kinds of stories of low quality food, ranging from the just unpalatable or not enough food to downright hazardous. The infamous rainbow meat that firefighters talk about, moldy food with animal infestations. One firefighter described an extended incident that was on their local district where they ran out of food. And then dinner with a single sandwich, a bag of chips, and a soda after having worked an entire shift. The next morning, they didn't get breakfast. These are quotes from my field notes. They didn't get breakfast, but the lady showed them a garbage bag full of croissants and said, "The critters got into this last night." And so this firefighter looked for croissants without visible bites. And of course, we know that eating food with rodents, eating food that has also been eaten by a rodent is a hazardous thing to do. Additionally, firefighters might have great access to safe water while they're on their home district, where they can fill up with water every day from their own canteens, or they can readily refill a cooler. But while working on extended incidents, the available drinking water may be of questionable quality. It could include water from plastic storage jugs that people put on top of their engines, sort of that emergency water, but it might have been sitting there for weeks. It might be water bottles sitting out in the sun for an unknown length of time, or water treated with iodine or other disinfecting agents. And there are concerns about the chemicals that can leach out of plastic water bottles, including bisphenols, microplastics, and phthalates, all of which can, the levels of all of those compounds increase over time, and in particular, they increase in conditions of heat and direct sun exposure. So if you imagine at a wildland incident, you have pallets of bottled water sitting out in the sun for days or weeks. You don't know how long it's been there, and that water, that the plastic is getting hit by heat and hit by sun, and so you end up with higher and higher levels of phthalates and plasticizers in that drinking water. But firefighters don't have an option to get different water if they're on a large incident. The last category of hazards is not something that I would have known about, but when I was talking to firefighters last summer about this sort of inventory of environmental hazards I was putting together, a lot of them mentioned government housing. Government housing is not required, but in some places it might be either the most, it might be either the place that's seen as the only convenient housing option. For example, if you're on a shot crew and your duty station is 2 hours from the nearest city, if you're going to have a place where you rent, the only reasonable place to rent is the government housing, or it might be seen as the only affordable housing. If you are so for example, there was a story that I saw last summer about folks who were living in Yellowstone. And they were working for the National Park System, and there was government housing that they could access in Yellowstone. You can imagine how expensive it might be to try to rent a place in Yellowstone as a seasonal park worker. And so living in government housing might be seen as the only affordable option. But folks recounted a whole range of hazards that they experienced in government housing: asbestos, black mold, lead, animal and insect infestations, broken appliances, leaking roofs, and just downright filthy conditions. They also told me that at least in some cases, they suspected that if they raised concerns about the quality of housing, that the housing would just be closed or they would be evicted rather than the hazard being eliminated. And so they were less likely to try to fix the hazard because they didn't see that there was much of an option. So I've identified a whole lot of environmental health hazards that wildland firefighters experience on a routine basis or as an unavoidable part of their job. What could be done about this? OSHA and public health scholars, industrial hygiene scholars talk about a hierarchy of controls, which identifies what types of interventions are the most effective and what types of interventions can be implemented at different scales. This hierarchy of controls model identifies things like PPE as the least effective at actually reducing risk to workers, whereas elimination of the hazard is seen as the most effective. But in my research, I also identified barriers to implementing changes that might reduce exposure to hazards, both practical barriers and cultural barriers. So on the practical side, the work environment for wildland firefighters offers a unique combination of physiological, psychological, performance, and safety demands that includes long and unpredictable shifts in remote, isolated, and rugged conditions with limited infrastructure, which makes guidelines intended to reduce exposures in other industries or other settings either very difficult or just completely impractical. Some hazards can't be avoided the way wildland fire is currently fought, and others can't be avoided at all unless we stop responding to certain locations. You can't avoid potential exposures to things like abandoned mine sites if you're willing to do a wildland operation in an area with abandoned mines. And then even things like hand washing, which might be taken for granted in most situations, can be challenging in the wildland environment. From my observations, it was extremely common to eat in the field without hand washing. Although hand sanitizing after things like using a porta potty or an outhouse, that was very common. That people were good at using the hand sani, but there was no hand washing before meals. And it's hard to imagine how you could really implement a hand washing station. In addition, there are cultural barriers to addressing some of these hazards. Despite extensive work developing a safety or learning culture that's taken place in land management agencies, wildland firefighter culture remains risk tolerant and biased towards action in many ways. Firefighters are also trained to think about risks as relative, potentially leading them to devalue chronic risks over the more immediate risks of things like being burned by a fire or concerns about things like snags. Furthermore, the routine nature of some of these hazards might hinder the identification and mitigation of the hazards. Once I started working on this, I remarked at how little I had observed about my own exposure to hazards, even someone, with extensive training in environmental health and toxicology. But I interpret that as this just wasn't part of how wildland firefighters are trained to think about the things that are hazardous. The things that are hazardous are things related to the wildland fire, not the things that are part of your daily job, the stuff that you're touching, the gear that you're handling, the engine that you're taking care of. So if we return to the idea of public health, we can think about how we can address wildland firefighter safety as a public health issue, not just as a limited individual or occupational issue. So public health is an interdisciplinary field working to understand health at the community or population level, looking to analyze determinants of health, and to develop and implement activities that promotes health and protects people in those communities. And we've seen advances in the field of wildland fire, at least for federal firefighters. Public health research can be used to direct action, direct policy, direct legislation. So in 2022, the National Defense Authorization Act created a presumptive cancer program for federal wildland firefighters. And so now certain conditions, these conditions here, and then very recently some reproductive cancers were added to this list. Certain conditions are now presumed to be occupationally related and are thus eligible for compensation if people who have a certain amount of federal employment as a firefighter and identify this illness within a certain a limited window of their employment. And so here we have an example of growing awareness about hazards in this occupational group, growing awareness about the potential of these different exposures. In particular, there's a lot of attention, as I've said before, to issues of smoke exposure. that has been able to drive improvements for at least this limited subsection of relatively permanent federal firefighters. At Whitman, again, public health has long been something that students are interested in. About 15% of our student body is formally pre-health in some way. That might be, that's certainly not just pre-public health, but there's a lot of attention to public health among our students. As part of a group of faculty and staff that I've been working with since 2023 to think about how we can bring a public health program to Whitman, we have found over 115 recent alums who've gone on to a Master's of Public Health or other related graduate program. We did a survey, a very quick and non-representative sample of students who were interested in public health, and they really want there to be a public health program. Many of them saying that they were personally very interested. And so what we're doing now is working to establish an interdisciplinary concentration in public health. We're currently hiring for the first professor of public health that Whitman will have. And this concentration, if it's approved by the faculty at a vote in the coming weeks, would involve courses from across the campus, along with foundational public health courses and an applied or experiential capstone experience. We are also thinking about what it would take to build this out to a major. And so this would require us to bring in more faculty positions to supplement the expertise we already have here on campus. So that's my presentation. Happy to take questions. Happy to also communicate with people over email if you have questions and want to connect later on. So thank you so much. And I think I'm passing it back to Jen, but I'm not totally sure.
Yep, I'm going to introduce our Vice President for Development and Alumni Relations, Steve Setchell, who may have something to say.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, Dr. Cordner. What a wonderful opportunity to go back to school. Alissa is just a great ambassador for teacher scholars at Whitman, not only dedicated to, teaching and guiding our students, but she's really at the forefront of her field and her research and bringing that expertise into the classroom, into our community for all of us to benefit. So thank you. I just wanted to quickly share Dr. Cordner foreshadowed this a little bit, but through the Upward Together campaign, we are actually seeking to endow a professor in public health. This would be in addition to the hire that Alissa referred to. So I just want to make that known. If any of you are interested in learning more about how to invest in public health, please let me know. My colleague Sarah Fry is on the screen as well. And we're delighted to speak with you or take your referrals of friends, classmates, strangers on the street you may know who'd like to help us bring public health program to Whitman. So thank you in advance for that. And really, if there are questions for Dr. Cordner, please, in fact, we've got one in the chat there. Alissa, can you see that? I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
I can. So I have never encountered this, and I'm trying to remember if I've heard any folks. I have never had this come up in an interview or with people I'm riding along with. That doesn't mean that people aren't concerned about illegal drugs. I think there are a lot of concerns about what firefighters, at least some firefighters, call stupid human tricks, the irresponsible behaviors that people might be engaging in on the forest and how that might increase risks to them. In a paper that I didn't talk about today, I identify, I talk through how firefighters make sense of the various risks that they experience, and the training that folks receive really focuses on reducing the risk of entrapment, the risk of being overrun by a fire or being burned alive, which is absolutely something that firefighters need to pay attention to and need training in and need to be constantly aware of. And at the same time, firefighters identify a pretty broad suite of social hazards that they experience or that they are attuned to and work to reduce. And one of those hazards that they're constantly aware of is hazards that can come from the general public, from interactions with the public. And with some, certainly not all, but with some members of the non-resident camper population, there are a lot of concerns about drug paraphernalia, drug use, drug storage, that kind of thing. But I have not heard about firefighters encountering illegal grows. I'm sure that has happened. And so that's something that I can add to the sort of longer list of things that, that people are experiencing. And then how the current federal government approach public health impacting students' academics and professional desires in the field? I'm sure there is variation, and in how students are experiencing this. From the students who I talk to, they feel motivated, honestly. They feel compelled to work in fields that they think matter. And the fact that currently there are some political attacks on the idea of public health, the idea of thinking about health at the community level and wanting to support health at the community level, at the level of the population, and not just for individuals thinking about their own individual health one at a time. I think students are really compelled to do that work, honestly. There is a lot of, there's certainly a lot of concern about what it might mean to go into those fields from maybe concern is not the right word. There's a lot of concern about how public health is being framed politically in this current moment. I personally have only seen that translate into students thinking that it is even more important to do this work, honestly. But I'm sure there is a range of student experiences. I will say I have written multiple MPH application recommendation letters already this semester, and I have another one still to write. So it's not impacting what students want to do in terms of grad school. In my anecdotal experience.
That's good.
An increase in drone use to gauge where a fire might be moving. So there are so many different uses of drones, and certainly real-time fire monitoring is one. I think the bigger way that fire, like once a fire becomes established and managed as a complex incident, drones are used. In my understanding, drones are more likely to be used in planning operations than in trying to predict where a fire is going to go. That type of prediction isn't as likely to rely on drone footage. And instead, firefighters are getting, daily satellite measurements of fire severity that look for heat maps, basically. So that's what I would say in terms of how firefighters are predicting where a fire might be moving. It's more the satellite data combined with fire modeling around slope and fuel loading and that kind of thing, along with just firefighters' own expertise about having seen the land, seen the terrain where they think the fire is going to go. But drones are used for all kinds of other things around fire modeling, around developing pods, these tools that are used to identify potential fuel breaks or lines that could be used for fire management, I mentioned the ignitions, but also used for things like gridding. So instead of having firefighters themselves out looking for smokes in, say, a prescribed fire or in a mop-up scenario, you can have a drone do that to reduce the amount of time that firefighters spend tripping over logs and things, which is also good for reducing exposure. The use of structural firefighters interface with wildland firefighters. I think that on large incidents, in any place that has a significant wildland urban interface component, the work that wildland folks and structure folks are doing is going to completely overlap in some parts of the incident and partially overlap in others. So I think it really does depend on where the incident is and what where in terms of what region of the country, and also where in terms of just the particularities of the incident. I've certainly been on fires where there's a lot of structure protection being done. There's structure protection, maybe a whole division of the fire is devoted to structure protection. And then of course, some of the fires, the sort of urban conflagration fires where maybe there's a wildland origin of the fire, but it quickly becomes, so the fires in Maui, the fires in LA this past winter, those might have a wildland origin, but it very quickly becomes just an urban conflagration. It is a house fire to house fire spread. It's no longer really a wildland fire, even though it was wildland in origin, and there might be wildland fuels mixed in. And so there, the line between what is a structure firefighter and what is a wildland firefighter, it is it is only in the name of the person's profession as opposed to the work that they might be doing. Longitudinal studies of wildland firefighter health, I would say, are limited. There are I don't know of any prospective studies of firefighter health that are, say, gathering a group of wildland folks and then trying to track them through time. One of the things that I write about more in this paper is the challenges with studying wildland firefighter health are really substantial because of their unusual career trajectories. On the structure fire side, you might have someone who starts in a fire organization, say like they sign up with the Walla Walla County Fire District when they're 18 as a volunteer, and they volunteer there for a couple of years, then they get hired over in the city, and then they work for 35 years for the city fire department until they retire. That might be the career history of a retired chief who I was talking to just last night. So you might have someone who lived in the same place, worked in the same department for virtually their entire career. On the wildland side, you might have people who work in 18 different fire organizations in the course of a single summer. You might have folks who spend time in the private sector and then time in the government sector. You might have folks who in the summer work in fire, and then in the winter work in construction or work in the service industry or go surfing. So you have really complex and fragmented personal histories that make it really hard to track occupational health. And you have a lot of folks who do a couple seasons of wildland fire when they are younger and then don't make a career out of it, when that is less common on the structure side. So all that's to say, we know a whole lot more about structure firefighter health than we do about wildland firefighter health. Additionally, the structure folks have a really robust union. The International Association of Firefighters has extremely broad coverage of firefighters in the US and Canada. I think they claim to represent something like 85% of departments in some capacity. So they have really broad coverage. And then on the wildland side, unless you opt in, unless you're a full-time or a permanent federal employee and you opt into the union, you're unlikely to be unionized in any way. So again, all that's to say, limited research on wildland folks. There certainly are some studies that in a cross-sectional way try to link up employment history in the wildland sector with health outcomes. There also is quite a bit of modeling research that's been done to say how much wildfire smoke are you exposed to? What are the levels of particulate matter? And then can you use that to model lung cancer risk, for example? But this is really an area of needed research. How are urban firefighters integrated or used in the wildfire scenarios without a structure exposure? I think this again just really depends on the incident. So in a wildland urban interface fire situation, you might have wildland folks doing external structure suppression, and you might have structure folks who are working on suppressing vegetation. But I think it really does depend on the incident. I would imagine that structure folks are going to be wearing if they're in an active incident, they're in suppression, they're likely wearing their heavy turnout gear. They might have their SCBAs on, and so they have more exposure to heat because their turnout gear is so much heavier than wildland turnout gear. And there's a lot of limitations that come with using the SCBAs, the respirator, the contained air units. And so, well, I'm not sure I've answered your question. If I haven't answered your question, let me know. But I guess I think it depends quite a bit on what the scenario is. I will say one more thing, which is in sort of complex, large incidents, when you might have a whole division of folks who are responding and doing structure protection, it might be folks with structure experience who are responding to where a fire might be doing. They might be doing some triage work. They might be trying to reduce fuels or reduce risk to structures, even if they're not actively doing suppression like at the front of the fire. And then our N95 is mandatory to mitigate dust. So until very, very recently, N95s were not permitted for any even light duty firefighters on the federal side. Very recently, and perhaps largely because of some media conversations, federal agencies did put out a notice that light duty, so there's different categories of how arduous your work is, doing different types of wildland work. And so folks who are like in camp, doing the planning, doing the logistics, doing operations support, those folks are now permitted to order N95s on large incidents. N95s are not allowed for any sort of arduous work. If you think about an N95, if it's properly fitted, there's a tremendous amount of heat and condensation inside that N95. This isn't us like wearing our KN95s to go to the grocery store where the air just goes in and out, in and out. This is like a properly fitted N95 where you can't smell anything. It is, in my opinion, and in the perspectives of folks I've talked about, it's completely impractical to be wearing a N95 doing arduous duty wildland work. And so then the question becomes, if you want to use some sort of N95 or other respirator to reduce dust and smoke exposure, you have to be changing the work that firefighters are doing. There's no way to dig line and wear an N95. I think that's impossible. But maybe there's a way to be engaged in less vigorous, less physically exhausting suppression work, maybe, and wear respiratory protection. And then hoping that structure folks are doing perimeter work due to their lack of experience. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. I think again, it would work. It would depend on the incident and sort of what the management structure was like and what the particular assignment of that team would be, or what that crew would be. From all of my observations and conversations, fire management managers are so thoughtful about doing everything they can to not put their people in harm's way, because there's so much awareness of how risky the job is. And so I don't think it's the case that structure folks are pulling up in their structure engine and getting, sent to dig line as the sort of first line of defense. I think there is a lot of strategic use of resources in almost all incidents. And then how much experience does a firefighter need to have to be on a hotshot team? There are all kinds of different categories of fire crews, and hotshots are a particular type of initial attack resource. Hotshots have to have, the crews themselves have very particular standards in terms of how many people you have to have at different levels of experience. And so the crew overall has to be relatively more experienced compared to most other initial attack hand crews. There's a limited number of rookie firefighters that you can have. And so to be on a hotshot crew in particular, it's unlikely to get hired onto a hotshot crew without any prior experience. It would be more common to do a year or several in different fire management organizations, working for a contractor, working for a state or federal agency.
I think Alissa might have just hung up on us. But we'll give her a second to come back.
Jennifer?
Jim?
Yeah, I was going to answer that last question a little bit there. For those of us who were trained as structural firefighters in our department, we were also cross-trained in wildland, just as a matter of fact in the federal government. And then a certain percentage of our guys all had red cards for wildland firefighting. So there was a constant awareness and interface, and that's typical of a lot of departments. People are cross-trained.
Oh, okay.
Appreciate you wearing your Bainbridge Fire Department gear today, Jim.
That's nice. That's nice. We've got a couple of firefighters on with us today.
Yeah, I thought I'd dress appropriately,
Yeah, very nice. Very nice. Well, I've just texted Alissa and I haven't heard back from her yet.
There's Alissa.
Here she comes.
I think you're muted, Alissa.
So
There
sorry.
we go.
My computer gave me a low battery warning, which it does at 50%, and then it just turned off about 2 minutes later. So I'm very sorry.
We wondered if it
While
was
you
too
were
many
away.
questions.
Too many questions, yes.
Yeah.
No, there are never
While
too
you
many
were
questions.
away, Jim Dow was just sharing his training, his cross training as a structural and wildland firefighter in Bainbridge there. And I think some of our other firefighters were nodding. Perhaps they had similar experiences. So we'll turn it back to you, Alissa. Glad you're with us again.
Well, I lost all of your questions. So I guess you
So
could, were you,
I
or if
think
you
I
want-
can read one.
Okay, sure. Yes.
Yeah, so long-term exposure to the caustic elements in a fire without masking is a long-term presumptive workers' comp claim nightmare. They see the
Mhm.
health issues down the road. Maybe just a comment, I guess, rather than a question. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Well, I think that what, at least what I have heard is likely to happen in those situations, other than this new federal, for federal employees with more than 5 years cumulative experience and who are within 10 years of federal employment, if you're not in that category and it's not one of those illnesses, the workers' comp, they're just going to deny it because there are so many potentially confounding causes of respiratory illnesses or cancers, and there are not presumptive for wildland folks, unlike on the structure side, they're not unlike for career structure folks, because I know Jim and I have talked about this as well with the volunteer versus career folks. The presumptive illness thing doesn't hold, and so there are lots of reasons to think that workers' comp would just deny that claim, unfortunately. Even if there's really strong evidence that, as you said, breathing in wildfire smoke for a career is obviously going to cause harm to your body.
Alissa, I was wondering if there were any advocacy groups working on behalf of wildlife firefighters.
There are, yes. There are folks coming from different angles. So there is the Wildland Firefighters Foundation, which does direct support for firefighters who are hurt or impacted in the line of duty, or who tried for their families if people are killed. And they do a lot of advocacy for wildland firefighters in general. There's the Grassroots Firefighter Foundation, I think it is, the Grassroots Firefighter Alliance, and they are doing direct lobbying. There's been a real pickup in direct lobbying to federal elected officials on behalf of firefighters around things like firefighter pay issues. So until the early 2020s, the starting sort of GS3 wage for federal firefighters was sub $15 an hour for this type of work. So there was a real push during the Biden administration to up there was a temporary pay increase, and then that was set to expire. So there was a lot of lobbying around making that pay increase permanent, which has happened. Although there are still some questions about how some of the supplemental pay increases are applied or protected or not protected. So there's that type of advocacy. There also has been lobbying around things like expanding the coverage under the presumptive illness part of the NDAA for federal folks. So I mentioned that recently some reproductive cancers have been added, and the first round of presumptive cancers did not include any female reproductive cancers. And now there's a few of those that have been added. So there's that type of advocacy. There are also groups that are working on trying to think about wildland firefighting, not just in terms of health, so including health and mental health, but also larger worker conditions things, and things like addressing what people talk about as the firefighting paradox, which is the more effective firefighters are at suppressing, the more there is a buildup of fuel. So the next time there's a fire there, the greater the potential for extreme fire behavior. And so there are groups like FUSI, which is based out of Eugene, Oregon, and they're doing both sort of within the firefighting community work, and then also external advocacy work around broader issues of fire management. Yeah.
Thank you. It looks like one more question about does the penitentiary have a firefighter unit? And I don't know.
I have never heard about any firefighter program within the pen. So I don't know, but I've never heard of one. The CC has a strong fire science program, and they have they have an EMS class, and they have I think it's an associate's in fire science at the community college here. But but I think that the larger question about sort of inmate firefighters, there's not an inmate crew that comes out of the Walla Walla pen.
All right. Well, I think that will wrap it up. Thank you, Alissa, so much for sharing this information with us and the research you're doing on behalf of our wildland firefighters. It's important stuff. And I'm also very happy to hear how many MPH grad school applications you're writing letters of recommendation for.
Yes.
Appreciate
so
that.
many letters. Thank you, everybody. And feel free to reach out if you have questions.
Yep. We will send this recording out to our folks who were on and didn't make it to join us. So you may hear from people a couple weeks from now.